Trump administration mulls AI oversight before public release, NYT. The old approach just got more expensive. The practical edge now comes from changing process, timing, and tooling together. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Move fast, break things dominated. But here's what changed. The New York Times reported the Trump team is considering mandatory review gates before companies launch AI systems publicly. Not after. Before. This is not a small policy move. It compresses the entire timeline between lab and market. It means startups can't ship on Friday and ask for forgiveness on Monday. They need legal clearance, audit infrastructure, and compliance infrastructure before the first user touches the product. Let's unpack why this matters and who it actually affects. First, the immediate effect: compliance costs just got front-loaded. Right now, if you're a startup with a Series A round and a promising LLM application, you budget for engineers, cloud compute, sales. Starting today, or soon, you need to budget 4 to 8 weeks minimum for pre-launch review cycles. That's legal fees. That's audit time. That's infrastructure just to meet the gate before you go live. Who can actually afford that? Funded companies with 18-month runways. Established players with in-house compliance teams. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, they already have regulatory infrastructure. A team of 12 engineers in Bangalore or Austin building the next thing. They hit a wall. This is the compliance moat. It's not new, it's how pharma works, how finance works. But AI was supposed to be different. It wasn't. And now the rules are catching up. Here's the second layer most people miss: slower feature velocity, but reduced chaos. If every major release needs pre-approval, you don't get surprise safety issues that tank stock prices. You don't get product shutdowns mid-launch. Liability gets pushed upstream to the approval gate, not downstream to the platform. For risk-averse enterprises buying AI tools, this is actually good news. Predictability beats speed. But here's the tension nobody's talking about yet. Pre-release vetting works only if the vetting apparatus is competent and fast. If the review cycle becomes a 6-month bureaucratic slog, innovation doesn't mature, it just moves overseas or underground. China doesn't wait for vetting gates. Europe's already doing this with AI Act compliance, and it's slowed down deployment there measurably. For investors, this changes how you model cap tables. Compliance costs are no longer a back-office line item, they're a core product cost, baked into every launch cycle. For founders, this is a constraint that favors scale and capital. For enterprise buyers, this is risk reduction. The real question is timing and scope. Will this apply to all AI releases, or just certain risk categories? Will the Trump administration staff up the vetting infrastructure, or will they create a gate that exists but doesn't actually review anything? That's where the real story is. Here's what I'd watch: over the next 60 days, look for guidance on which AI systems require pre-release approval. If it's narrow, only systems handling sensitive data, for example, this is manageable. If it's broad, the startup ecosystem contracts and consolidates further toward incumbents. For anyone building in AI right now, don't wait for clarity. Start building compliance checklists now. Budget for legal consultation. Map your review timeline into your product roadmap. The old playbook of moving fast and breaking things just got a 4 to 8 week gate in front of it. This is the maturation of the market, whether the market likes it or not. Subscribe to Atlas Signal for daily intelligence on how policy, markets, and technology intersect. Follow us at atlassignal.in for the full analysis. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.